Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into something you've probably never thought twice about: sleep. Specifically, what it was like trying to get a good night's rest in medieval times. Spoiler alert, it wasn't exactly cosy. From the moment the sun went down to the first light of dawn, medieval people faced challenges we can barely imagine today. So before we get started, if you enjoy these deep dives into history, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing where everyone's tuning in from around the world. Now get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let's journey back to a time when simply closing your eyes at night was an act of courage. Imagine a world where darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was total, overwhelming, and slightly terrifying. When the sun dipped below the horizon in medieval Europe, entire villages plunged into blackness so complete you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. There were no streetlights guiding your path, no porch lights offering comfort, no flashlight apps to navigate your way to the privy. Just pure, unfiltered darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. For medieval people, nighttime was a different realm entirely. The day belonged to work, commerce, social gatherings, and productivity. But night belonged to uncertainty. Without artificial lighting, the world transformed into something unfamiliar and potentially dangerous. Shadows stretched longer, sounds became amplified and unidentifiable, and the mind had plenty of time to imagine all sorts of things lurking just beyond the edges of perception. Candles existed, sure, but they were expensive and precious. Made from tallow, rendered animal fat, or beeswax for the wealthy, candles were saved for special occasions or emergencies. Peasants couldn't afford to burn through their limited supply just because they felt like staying up late. So most families simply went to bed when it got dark, not because they were particularly tired, but because there wasn't much else they could do. Oil lamps provided another option, but again, oil was costly and not always available. Rushlights, reeds dipped in fat and lit like primitive candles, offered a cheaper alternative, but they burned quickly, smoked terribly, and gave off barely enough light to see the person sitting next to you. If you wanted to read a book by rushlight, you'd better have excellent eyesight and a lot of patience. The result was that medieval people lived according to natural rhythms dictated by the sun. When darkness fell, so did the curtain on daily activities. Families huddled around the dying embers of the hearth, told stories, prayed, and eventually drifted off to sleep in rooms lit only by the faint orange glow of fading coals. But here's where things get interesting. Without modern lighting, the night wasn't just dark, it was alive. The darkness seemed to move, to breathe, to whisper. Every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind rattling the shutters, every distant animal cry took on new significance when you couldn't see what was making the noise. The darkness played tricks on the mind, turning ordinary sounds into potential threats. And in a world where superstition ran deep and religion shaped every aspect of daily life, the night hours became associated with danger, evil spirits, and otherworldly forces. Darkness wasn't just physically uncomfortable, it was spiritually unsettling. Going to sleep meant surrendering to that darkness, closing your eyes and trusting that you'd wake up in the morning. For us today, flipping a switch banishes darkness instantly. For medieval people, darkness was an adversary they faced every single night, armed with nothing but faith, a thin blanket, and the hope that dawn would eventually come. When we think of bedrooms today, we imagine private spaces, personal sanctuaries with doors that close, walls that muffle sound, maybe a lock for extra privacy. Medieval peasants would have found this concept absolutely bizarre. Privacy? In a house barely larger than a modern garden shed? Not a chance. The typical peasant dwelling was a single-room structure, maybe 20 feet by 15 feet if you were lucky. Inside this cramped space lived an entire family. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, occasionally a cousin or two who'd fallen on hard times. And that's not even counting the animals. Yes, animals. Livestock often shared the same roof, sometimes separated by a low partition, sometimes just mingling freely with the humans. There were no hallways, no separate rooms, no master bedroom or guest room. There was just the room. One space where everything happened. Cooking, eating, working, sleeping, arguing, giving birth, and occasionally dying. The medieval home was less a house and more a multi-purpose survival box. Beds, in the sense that we understand them, were luxuries reserved for the wealthy. For most peasants, sleeping arrangements were far more basic. Some families had simple wooden frames strung with rope or leather straps, creating a somewhat supportive surface. On top of this went a mattress, and here's where you need to adjust your expectations, made of straw or hay stuffed into a rough cloth sack. This wasn't the comfortable, fluffy mattress you're imagining. Medieval straw mattresses were lumpy, uneven, constantly shifting, and filled with whatever opportunistic insects happened to be living in the straw when it was harvested. Fleas were almost guaranteed, bedbugs were common, and if you lived near grain storage, congratulations, you might also have mice as bedmates. The straw needed regular replacement because it flattened quickly, grew mouldy from body moisture, and eventually started composting from the inside out. Changing the straw was a major household task, and many families only did it a few times a year. So yes, for months at a time, you were sleeping on gradually decomposing plant matter. Many poorer families skipped the bed frame entirely, and simply piled straw directly on the dirt floor. You'd create a nest of sorts, arrange your family members in a human pile for warmth, throw whatever cloth you owned over everyone and call it a night. Romantic? Not exactly. Practical? Absolutely. Even those fortunate enough to have a proper bed face challenges. Bed frames were wooden and prone to harbouring all sorts of unwelcome guests in their cracks and crevices. The rope or leather straps supporting the mattress would stretch and sag over time, creating an uncomfortable hammock effect. And because these beds were valuable possessions, they were often shared by multiple family members. 3 or 4 people crammed into a space barely big enough for 2. Children typically slept together in a separate pile of straw, often in the loft space if the house had a second level. This kept them out of the way and utilised every inch of available space. The loft had its own challenges: poor ventilation, extreme temperatures, broiling hot in summer, freezing in winter, and the ever-present danger of rolling off the edge in your sleep. Blankets and covers were made from wool, which was itchy, scratchy, and retained moisture like a sponge. On cold nights, families piled on every piece of cloth they owned: old cloaks, worn-out tunics, animal skins if they had them. The weight of all these layers was supposed to provide warmth, but it often just created a heavy, suffocating feeling while still leaving your extremities cold. The medieval bedroom had no doors to close, no windows with glass to keep out drafts, no heating beyond the central hearth, and absolutely zero soundproofing. If someone across the room was snoring, you heard it. If the baby was crying, everyone knew. If Dad had indigestion from dinner, well, the whole family suffered together. And let's not forget that this single room also doubled as the kitchen, workshop and bathroom. That's right. Chamber pots were kept right there in the sleeping area, used during the night because going outside in total darkness to the outdoor privy was even worse than dealing with the smell. Morning meant emptying these pots, which was just part of the charming routine of medieval domestic life. So when we talk about medieval sleep, we're not talking about retiring to a quiet, comfortable bedroom. We're talking about collapsing onto a pile of increasingly questionable straw, surrounded by your entire extended family, various farm animals, the lingering smell of dinner, and probably a few rats, all while hoping that tomorrow you'd wake up feeling at least slightly rested. Medieval people didn't go to bed, they survived bedtime. If you've ever experienced a winter power outage, you have a tiny glimpse into what medieval nights felt like. Now multiply that discomfort by every single night for your entire life, with no modern solutions available, and you're starting to get the picture. Medieval homes were brutally cold in winter. The walls, made of wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with mud, straw and sometimes animal dung, provided minimal insulation. They kept out rain reasonably well and blocked some wind, but thermal insulation? Not so much. If it was 30 degrees outside, it might be 35 inside. Congratulations, you've gained 5 whole degrees. The hearth in the centre of the room was the only heat source, and it was a temperamental, demanding companion. Keeping it going through the night required constant attention. Someone had to wake up periodically to add fuel, wood, peat, dried animal dung, whatever was available, and stoke the coals. Let it die completely, and you'd face the miserable task of restarting it in the freezing pre-dawn darkness. But here's the catch. Even with the fire burning, warmth was unevenly distributed. If you slept close to the hearth, you might stay relatively warm, maybe even uncomfortably hot on one side while freezing on the other. But if you were relegated to sleeping farther away, near the walls or in the corners, you were essentially camping indoors. The fire's warmth barely reached you, and the cold from the walls and floor seemed to actively suck heat from your body. Medieval people understood this problem and developed various strategies to combat it. The most effective? Body heat. Families slept in close clusters, creating human heat generators. Children were sandwiched between adults. Elderly grandparents who had difficulty maintaining body temperature were placed in the middle of the group. Sometimes even trusted friends or servants joined the sleeping pile. There was no shame in communal sleeping. It was pure survival. Livestock played a crucial role in home heating. A cow or pig generates significant body warmth, and medieval people took full advantage of this. Having animals inside wasn't just about protecting them from theft or predators. It was about utilising their heat. A healthy cow is like a living, breathing space heater that never runs out of batteries. Sure, it also produces methane, manure, and considerable noise, but desperate times called for practical solutions. Clothing became part of the sleeping strategy too. People didn't change into pyjamas, they just kept wearing their daytime clothes, sometimes adding extra layers. Wool tunics, cloaks, whatever you owned, all stayed on. Removing clothes would mean losing precious body heat, and besides, your night clothes were probably just as uncomfortable as your daytime wear anyway. Some families used heated stones as primitive bed warmers. You'd heat a large stone in the fire until it was scorching hot, wrap it in cloth, carefully because burns were a real risk, and tuck it into the straw mattress before climbing in. It provided a wonderful pocket of warmth for a few hours, though by morning it was just another cold lump in your bed. But let's talk about what happened when the fire did go out, because it happened often. Maybe someone forgot to add fuel, maybe the wood ran out, maybe the wind shifted and snuffed the flames through some cruel trick of airflow. Whatever the reason, you'd wake up in the middle of the night to complete darkness and rapidly plummeting temperatures. Restarting a fire in medieval times wasn't like striking a match. It required striking flint against steel to create sparks, catching those sparks on tinder, dried moss, fungus or cloth, blowing gently to coax a flame, and then carefully building up from there. All of this while your fingers were numb, your breath was fogging, and your family was collectively willing you to hurry up before everyone turned into popsicles. Summer presented different challenges. The same houses that trapped cold in winter also trapped heat. The thatched roofs absorbed sunlight all day and radiated it back into the living space all night. Sleeping inside became suffocating. Many families actually slept outdoors during summer months, spreading straw in the yard or garden and hoping it wouldn't rain. Medieval people also dealt with dramatic temperature swings during shoulder seasons, spring and fall. The day might be pleasantly warm, but the moment the sun set, temperatures could drop 30 or 40 degrees. Without thermostats or central heating, you just had to adapt on the fly, adding or removing layers, moving closer to or farther from the fire, and generally playing a nightly game of temperature roulette. Wealthy nobles fared better, of course. They had actual fireplaces with chimneys instead of just open hearths. They owned thick tapestries that provided wall insulation. They slept in curtained beds, enclosed wooden frames with heavy drapes all around, creating a small, warmer microclimate. But even then, castles and manor houses were notorious for being draughty, cold, and generally miserable in winter. For the average medieval peasant, cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Hypothermia was a real threat, especially for the very young, the elderly, and the sick. Frostbite could claim fingers and toes, and the constant stress of being cold wore down the immune system, making people more susceptible to illness. Every night was a negotiation with temperature, a delicate balance of maintaining the fire, positioning bodies strategically, and hoping your layers of itchy wool and questionable bedding would be enough to see you through to morning. Medieval sleep wasn't restful, it was survival, and when you finally woke up, still cold but alive, you counted yourself fortunate. Because tomorrow night you'd have to do it all over again. We've touched on how dark medieval nights were, but let's really explore what that meant for sleep. Today, we have nightlights, streetlights bleeding through curtains, glowing alarm clocks, the soft LED indicators on electronics. We're never truly in complete darkness. Medieval people knew darkness in a way we've almost completely forgotten. Inside a medieval home after the fire died down and the last rushlight burned out, the darkness was absolute. Not turn off the lights dark, not cloudy night dark. We're talking can't see your hand touching your nose dark. This level of darkness did strange things to the human mind. Your eyes would strain uselessly, trying to find any scrap of visual information. Sometimes you'd start seeing things that weren't there. Flashes of light, shapes moving at the edge of non-existent vision. This is a real phenomenon called prisoner's cinema or phosphins, where your visual system, starved of input, starts generating its own signals. Medieval people had no scientific explanation for this. They just knew that in deep darkness their eyes played tricks. Sounds became magnified and distorted. Every creak of the house settling, every scratch of a mouse in the walls, every distant owl cry took on outsized significance. Your brain, without visual confirmation, would imagine the worst possible source for each noise. That scratching? Obviously rats. That distant howl? Wolves? Definitely wolves. Probably right outside. Medieval people were deeply superstitious, and the nighttime hours were considered when evil spirits roamed most freely. Demons, witches, fairies, vengeful ghosts, the catalogue of potential nocturnal threats was extensive and terrifying. And in complete darkness, unable to see what might be lurking in the corner or standing at the foot of your straw pile, your imagination ran wild. Parents told children stories about creatures that hunted at night, partly to keep them safely indoors after dark, but these stories had the side effect of making everyone terrified of the dark. The night hag, a demonic entity that supposedly sat on your chest while you slept, causing nightmares and difficulty breathing, was widely feared. Today we recognise these symptoms as sleep paralysis, a harmless if unsettling phenomenon. Medieval people thought they were being attacked by supernatural forces. Without light, basic nighttime needs became adventures. Need to use the chamber pot? Good luck finding it in pitch darkness without knocking it over or stepping in something worse. Need to check on a sick child? You'd have to feel your way across the room, hoping you didn't accidentally step on someone else in the process. Need to investigate a strange noise. You'd basically be operating on faith alone, fumbling through blackness toward the source of the sound. Some families kept a small oil lamp burning all night, but this was expensive and came with its own risks. Open flames and straw mattresses were not a safe combination. House fires were common and devastating. A single knocked-over lamp could turn your entire home into an inferno in minutes, and in the darkness and chaos, escape wasn't guaranteed. The darkness also affected sleep quality in ways medieval people couldn't understand. Humans have circadian rhythms evolved over millions of years to sync with natural light cycles. Complete darkness triggers melatonin production and signals sleep time, which worked fine for medieval people who went to bed at dusk. But if something woke you in the middle of the night, your body struggled to know whether to stay asleep or wake up fully. Without any light cues, many people experienced segmented sleep, sleeping in two separate chunks with a wakeful period in between. This first sleep and second sleep pattern was so common in medieval times that it was considered normal. People would sleep for 3 or 4 hours, wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night, during which they'd pray, have quiet, conversations, tend the fire or engage in intimate activities, then fall back asleep until dawn. Historical records from the period mention first and second sleep as casually as we'd mention morning and afternoon, but even this pattern didn't make the darkness less oppressive. During those wakeful hours in the middle of the night, you'd lie there in total blackness, listening to the chorus of snores, the occasional cry of a baby, the sounds of the night, all while being unable to see anything at all. Some people found this peaceful. Many found it deeply unsettling. The darkness also concealed real dangers. Home invasions happened. Thieves took advantage of the night to break into homes and steal what little peasants had. Without locks on doors, most peasants had simple wooden bars or latches at best. Without lights to deter criminals, without the ability to see intruders clearly, medieval people slept with one ear always listening for trouble. And then there were the animals. Rats were constant companions in medieval homes, attracted by stored grain, food scraps, and the warmth of human dwellings. In darkness, rats grew bold, scurrying across sleeping bodies, nibbling on fingernails, toenails, and even sleeping faces. Waking up to the sensation of tiny feet running across your chest was unpleasant enough when you could see. In complete darkness, it was genuinely frightening. Medieval people developed various coping strategies. Some families said prayers specifically for protection during the night hours. Others kept religious symbols near their sleeping areas, crosses, saint medallions, holy water, believing these would ward off evil influences. Some people tied bells to their doors and windows, so any movement would create noise and wake them. But ultimately, every medieval night required surrendering to the darkness. You'd lie down in your straw, pull your scratchy wool blanket up to your chin, close your eyes, and hope. Hope that nothing bad would happen. Hope that you'd wake up at dawn. Hope that the darkness was just darkness, nothing more. For us, turning off the lights is a choice we make when we're ready to sleep. For medieval people, darkness was an unavoidable force they faced every single night. A test of courage and faith that came with the setting sun. And in that darkness, sleep became not just rest, but an act of trust. Trust that morning would come, that you'd survive to see it, and that whatever lurked in the shadows would pass you by. If you think having a spider in your bedroom is bad, let me introduce you to the medieval sleeping experience, where the question wasn't, is there a bug in here? But rather, how many bugs are in here and which ones are currently biting me? Medieval beds were ecosystems. They were thriving communities of insects, parasites, and small rodents, all living their best lives at your expense. You weren't sleeping alone. You were sleeping in what was essentially a mobile zoo of things that bit, crawled, and occasionally spread disease. Let's start with fleas. These tiny jumping nightmares were everywhere in medieval Europe. They lived in the straw mattresses, in the cracks of wooden bed frames, in clothing, in animal fur, and of course on human skin. A medieval peasant encountering a flea-free environment would have probably thought they died and gone to heaven. Fleas are most active at night, which meant bedtime was prime feeding time. They'd hop onto your body, bite, drink their fill of blood, then hop away before you could catch them. 1 or 2 flea bites might be ignorable, but medieval people often dealt with dozens, sometimes hundreds of bites. The constant itching made sleep difficult, and scratching created open wounds that could become infected. But fleas were more than just annoying. They were vectors for disease, most famously the bubonic plague. The Black Death, which killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, was transmitted by fleas that had fed on infected rats. Medieval people had no idea that these tiny pests were capable of such devastation. They just knew that everyone itched all the time, and sometimes entire villages started dying for reasons nobody understood. Then there were bedbugs, which might be even worse than fleas because they're specifically adapted to human sleeping areas. Bedbugs hide during the day in tiny cracks and crevices, perfect hiding spots being the rough wood of bed frames and the woven straw of mattresses. At night, attracted by body heat and carbon dioxide from breathing, they emerge to feed. A bedbug bite is painless at first, but the aftermath is intensely itchy and can last for days. And bedbugs are prolific breeders. A single pregnant female can lead to an infestation of thousands within months. Medieval beds, rarely cleaned thoroughly and often used by multiple people over many years, were ideal bedbug habitats. Medieval people tried various methods to combat these pests. Some would take their straw mattresses outside on sunny days, hoping heat and light would drive out or kill some of the bugs. Others would rub strong-smelling herbs, wormwood, tansy, pennyroyal, into the bed frame and straw, believing the scent would repel insects. These methods had limited success at best. Lice were another constant companion. Head lice, body lice, and pubic lice all found medieval humans to be excellent hosts. With limited bathing, we'll get to that, infrequent clothes washing, and close sleeping quarters, lice spread easily through families and communities. People spent considerable time nitpicking, literally picking lice and their eggs out of each other's hair. It was a social activity, like grooming among primates, but far less pleasant. Body lice were particularly dangerous because they could transmit typhus, a bacterial disease that caused high fever, headaches, and often death. Typhus outbreaks regularly swept through medieval Europe, especially during wars when soldiers lived in close quarters with poor hygiene. But even in peacetime, body lice were everywhere, living in the seams of clothing and emerging to feed on human blood several times a day. Let's not forget mites. Scabies mites burrow under the skin to lay eggs, causing intense itching that's worse at night when you're warm under blankets. The itch is bad enough that it can prevent sleep entirely, and because scabies spreads through skin-to-skin contact, a single infected person sharing a bed could infect the whole family within days. Rodents were also regular sleeping companions. Mice and rats lived in the thatched roofs, in the walls, under the floors, and had no qualms about scurrying across sleeping humans in search of food. They'd nibble on anything. Stored grain, yes, but also leather, fabric, and even human fingernails and toenails if you slept deeply enough. Some medieval accounts describe people waking up to find rats had chewed their hair during the night. This sounds horrific and improbable, but rats are actually attracted to the natural oils in hair, and will gnaw on it if given the opportunity. They're also attracted to any food residue around the mouth or on hands, making faces and hands prime targets for nighttime nibbling. Larger animals sometimes made appearances too. Snakes could slither into houses attracted by the warmth and the rodent population. Depending on your region, this might mean harmless grass snakes or potentially venomous vipers. Waking up to find a snake sharing your straw bed was rare, but not unheard of, and absolutely terrified medieval people who considered snakes symbols of evil. Bats sometimes roosted in the rafters, and while they're generally harmless, they occasionally flew around inside the house at night, swooping and fluttering in the darkness, terrifying everyone. Their droppings accumulated in living spaces, creating both smell and health hazards. Even the livestock that shared the house could be problematic sleeping neighbours. A restless cow might knock over something in the night, startling everyone awake. Pigs sometimes decided to lie down on top of sleeping children, which was dangerous because pigs are heavy and children can suffocate. Chickens roosted in rafters and occasionally fell off, landing on surprise sleepers below. Medieval people didn't have effective pesticides, sealed environments, or regular professional cleaning. They accepted insect companions as an inevitable part of life. Children grew up being bitten nightly, so they developed some tolerance, but the constant low-level torment of itching, crawling sensations and interrupted sleep took a toll on everyone's health and well-being. Some wealthy nobles had it slightly better. They could afford to replace straw mattresses more frequently, and they slept in enclosed bed frames with curtains, which provided some protection. But even nobles dealt with fleas, lice and bedbugs. No amount of money could buy you a pest-free existence in the medieval world, so when medieval people went to sleep they weren't just lying down to rest. They were entering into a nightly battle, with an army of tiny creatures that saw them as a buffet. Sleep became an exercise in tolerance, in accepting that you would be bitten, that things would crawl on you, and that there was essentially nothing you could do about it except hope tomorrow's bites wouldn't be too numerous. And somehow, exhausted from a day of hard labour, they still managed to fall asleep, proving that humans can adapt to almost anything if they have to. But comfortable, peaceful, hygienic? Medieval sleep was none of these things. It was just what you endured until morning came. Let's address something that history books often gloss over. Medieval homes smelled absolutely terrible, and nowhere was this more concentrated than in the sleeping areas. If you could travel back in time, before you even saw medieval life, you'd smell it, and you'd probably want to leave immediately. Start with the fact that medieval people bathed infrequently. This wasn't because they loved being dirty. Water was often scarce, heating water was labour-intensive, and fully immersing yourself in water was believed by some to be unhealthy, opening your pores to disease. So most people went weeks or even months between proper baths. A quick wash of hands and face was common, but full body washing, special occasion only, without regular bathing, natural body odour accumulated. Now multiply that by an entire family sleeping in close quarters. Add in the fact that people wore the same clothes day and night for extended periods, and you're starting to get the picture. The medieval sleeping area had a thick, musty human smell that never quite went away. Clothing compounded the problem. Wool tunics, which most people wore, absorbed sweat and body oils. When wool gets wet or damp, it develops a distinctive, pungent smell. Think wet dog, but with additional notes of human. And since people didn't have multiple outfits, they just kept wearing the same increasingly fragrant garments day after day. The straw mattresses added their own special contribution to the olfactory experience. Fresh straw smells pleasant enough, like dried grass, maybe hay. But after weeks or months of absorbing body moisture, sweat, the occasional bedwetting accident, and slowly decomposing from the inside, it developed a sour, musty, vaguely rotting smell. Think of damp basement mixed with old grass clippings. Then there were the animals. Remember, livestock often shared the living space. Cows, pigs, chickens, goats, each with their own distinctive aroma. Animal urine, animal feces, animal breath, wet animal fur, all of these contributed to the indoor air quality. A pig sleeping 6 feet away from your head doesn't exactly create a pleasant sleep environment. Chamber pots deserve special mention. These ceramic or wooden containers served as nighttime toilets, used by everyone in the household, and then simply left sitting there in the sleeping area until morning. The smell of urine and feces permeated the space. Morning meant emptying these pots, usually out the window or door into the street, but the smell lingered in the room. Some families had designated areas for the chamber pot, usually near a wall or in a corner. Others just kept it wherever was convenient. Either way, you were sleeping mere feet away from a container of waste. Medieval noses became somewhat desensitized. When everyone and everything smells bad, the baseline shifts. But visitors from one household to another often found the transition challenging. Food smells added another layer. Since cooking and sleeping happened in the same room, the smell of whatever had been prepared for dinner hung in the air all night. Cabbage stew, salted fish, onions, turnips, foods that already have strong odours were cooked in an enclosed space with poor ventilation. The smells absorbed into the straw, the walls, the clothing, everything. Smoke was another major contributor. The central hearth had no proper chimney, so smoke filled the room before eventually finding its way out through holes in the roof or gaps in the walls. This smoke smell, wood smoke if you were lucky, peat smoke or dung smoke if you weren't, permeated every surface. People, furniture, food, everything smelled perpetually smoky. And the smoke carried with it other smells. If you were burning animal dung as fuel, common in areas where wood was scarce, that added its own distinctive aroma to the mix. Burning peat has a heavy, earthy smell. All of this smoke residue built up on walls, rafters and floors, creating a tarry coating that trapped odours. Illness added terrible smells to the sleeping environment. People with respiratory infections coughed and wheezed throughout the night. Digestive problems were common due to poor diet and food preservation issues, leading to unfortunate nighttime incidents. Infected wounds, rotting teeth and various other ailments all contributed their own unpleasant odours. Women's menstruation created additional challenges. Without modern hygiene products, women used cloth rags that were washed and reused, but not always thoroughly or frequently. The smell of blood and bodily fluids added to the already rich tapestry of medieval bedroom aromas. Medieval people tried to combat these smells in various ways. Herbs and rushes were scattered on the floor, lavender, rosemary, mint, sweet flag, hoping their pleasant scents would mask the unpleasant ones. Sometimes this worked, creating a brief period of slightly better smelling air, but the herbs eventually got crushed underfoot, mixed with dirt and spilled food, and added to the general floor funk rather than solving it. Some people burned incense or aromatic woods when they could afford it. Frankincense, myrrh and juniper were popular choices. Churches smelled relatively better than most homes, partly because of the regular use of incense during services. But for the average peasant household, incense was an unaffordable luxury. Sachets of dried flowers or herbs were sometimes tucked into straw mattresses or hung from the rafters. These provided a momentary whiff of something pleasant, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the other competing smells. Medieval medicine had theories about miasma, bad air that caused disease. They weren't entirely wrong. Poor air quality and hygiene did contribute to illness, though not in the way they understood. Some physicians recommended improving air quality by opening windows, which let in cold air and bugs, so this wasn't always practical, or by burning aromatic substances. But ultimately, medieval people just lived with the smell. They had no choice. It was the background odour of existence, as normal to them as fresh air is to us. Children grew up in these conditions and knew nothing else. Only when someone had the rare opportunity to spend time in a wealthy household, with better hygiene, more frequent changes of mattress straw and perhaps actual bathing facilities, did they realise that life could smell different. For us, with our daily showers, washing machines, scented candles and air fresheners, the idea of sleeping in a medieval bedroom would be almost unbearable. But for them, it was just another aspect of life, something to endure along with the cold, the darkness and the fleas. The medieval sleeping area was less a restful sanctuary and more an assault on every sense simultaneously. But exhaustion is a powerful force, and after a day of back-breaking labour, medieval people fell asleep despite the smell, proving once again that humans can adapt to almost anything when survival demands it. Though whether anyone actually enjoyed medieval sleep is another question entirely. In the medieval understanding of health, sleep was a double-edged sword, necessary for survival, but also potentially dangerous. Without any real knowledge of germ theory, nutrition, or proper hygiene, medieval people developed elaborate theories about when, how, and where to sleep to avoid illness. Most of these theories were completely wrong, but they shaped nighttime behaviour in fascinating ways. Medieval medicine was based largely on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this framework, health meant keeping these humours in balance, and many factors could disrupt that balance, including sleeping at the wrong time or in the wrong position. Physicians warned against sleeping immediately after eating, claiming it would cause indigestion and corrupt the humours. They recommended specific sleeping positions for different ailments: sleeping on your right side to aid digestion, on your left to help the heart, on your back never because it invited nightmares. One major concern was night air. Medieval people widely believed that the air at night was different from daytime air: colder, damper, filled with harmful vapours and miasmas that could cause disease. This was why windows, even in summer, were often kept closed or covered at night. Fresh air was considered dangerous after sunset, and breathing it while sleeping was thought to be especially risky. This belief wasn't entirely unfounded, even if the reasoning was wrong. Night air was indeed cooler and often damper, and sleeping in a cold, damp environment could contribute to respiratory problems. But the medieval conclusion that nighttime air itself was poisonous led to the opposite problem: sleeping in sealed, poorly ventilated rooms filled with smoke, body odour, and the breath of multiple people and animals. The air quality was often genuinely terrible, contributing to chronic respiratory issues, but medieval people thought they were protecting themselves. Sleeping positions were the subject of intense medical debate. Some physicians claimed that sleeping flat on your back caused phlegm to accumulate in the lungs and could lead to suffocation. Others warned that sleeping on your stomach put pressure on the heart and could stop it from beating properly. The consensus seemed to be that sleeping on your side was safest, preferably the right side, though opinions varied. Medieval people also worried about sleeping with their mouths open. This was thought to allow evil spirits or disease-causing vapours to enter the body directly through the throat. Children were taught to keep their mouths closed while sleeping, and some people even tied cloths around their heads to keep their jaws shut at night. Given the poor air quality in medieval bedrooms, mouth breathing probably did expose people to more airborne irritants, though evil spirits weren't the actual problem. Dreams were taken very seriously and were believed to have medical significance. Disturbing dreams or nightmares were thought to indicate imbalances in the humours or the presence of illness. Physicians would ask patients about their dreams when diagnosing ailments. If you dreamed of water, you might have too much phlegm. Dreams of fire suggested excess yellow bile. The interpretation of dreams was considered a legitimate diagnostic tool. Sleep paralysis, a phenomenon where you wake up but temporarily can't move or speak, terrified medieval people and was attributed to demonic attack. The night hag, or mare, from which we get the word nightmare, was thought to be a demon or evil spirit that sat on a sleeper's chest, paralysing them and sometimes trying to suffocate them. People who experienced sleep paralysis genuinely believed they had been attacked by supernatural forces. The timing of sleep was also medically regulated. Physicians recommended going to bed a few hours after sunset, after food had time to digest. Sleeping too soon after dark was thought to trap food in the stomach, causing it to rot and release harmful vapours into the body. Sleeping too late into the morning was considered lazy and unhealthy, allowing the body to become sluggish and corrupting the humours with excess moisture. Seasonal considerations played a role too. Summer sleep was thought to be lighter and less restorative than winter sleep, which was considered deeper and more nourishing. Physicians recommended sleeping longer hours in winter to compensate for the cold and shorter days, while summer required less sleep because the warmth and long days provided natural energy. Sleeping arrangements could supposedly affect your health. Sleeping alone was considered potentially dangerous because you had no one to generate shared warmth or to wake you if something went wrong. Sleeping with too many people, however, could cause you to breathe in their expelled vapours and become sick with their illnesses. Finding the right balance was important. Medieval doctors also had theories about who should sleep with whom. It was believed that young children benefited from sleeping near healthy adults because they could absorb good vapours and strengthen their own humours. Conversely, Sleeping near someone who was ill was dangerous because disease could transfer through shared air and contact. This wasn't entirely wrong. Contagious diseases did spread in close quarters, but the mechanisms they imagined were purely theoretical. Pregnant women received special sleeping advice. They were told to sleep on their right side to protect the developing baby, and to avoid sleeping on their back because the weight of the child could compress important organs. They should not sleep near anyone with a fever or disease, and they should keep their sleeping area especially warm because cold was thought to harm the unborn child. Some of this advice was actually helpful, even if the reasoning was faulty. The elderly were believed to need more sleep and warmer sleeping conditions because their bodies produced less natural heat. They were encouraged to sleep near the hearth and to pile on extra blankets. This advice probably did help older people survive harsh winters, even though the medical theory behind it was nonsense. Certain illnesses were specifically associated with sleep. Sleeping sickness was a general term for conditions that caused excessive drowsiness or inability to wake properly. Some of these were probably encephalitis, brain infections, or other serious neurological problems. Medieval medicine had no effective treatments, and often attributed these conditions to demonic possession or punishment from God. Insomnia was recognized as a medical problem, and various remedies were suggested. Warm milk before bed, herbal infusions of chamomile or valerian, prayers for peaceful sleep, wearing certain amulets or herbs under the pillow. Medieval people tried anything that might help. Some of these remedies, like warm milk and chamomile tea, actually do have mild sedative effects. Others were pure superstition, but might have worked through placebo effect. Sleepwalking was considered both fascinating and frightening. Medical texts describe people who got up during sleep and performed complex actions, walking, talking, even leaving their homes, without any awareness or memory afterward. This was attributed to the soul temporarily leaving the body or to demonic influence. The actual cause, a sleep disorder where the normal paralysis during sleep doesn't engage properly, was completely unknown. Snoring was seen as a medical symptom rather than just an annoyance. Loud, persistent snoring was thought to indicate blocked passages in the head, excess phlegm, or problems with the humours. Various treatments were suggested, including sleeping propped up, avoiding certain foods, or using herbal remedies to dry up excess moisture. Sleep apnea, which causes dangerous breathing pauses and loud snoring, was not recognised as a distinct condition. Medieval people also worried about sudden death during sleep. Stories circulated about healthy people who went to bed normally and were found dead in the morning with no apparent cause. Without understanding heart attacks, strokes, aneurysms, or other sudden fatal events, these deaths were attributed to everything from divine judgment to demonic attack, to the soul simply deciding to leave the body during the night. Children's sleep was carefully monitored because infant and child mortality was horrifically high. Mothers feared their babies dying during the night from unknown causes, what we now call SIDS, Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. Medieval people attributed these tragic deaths to overlaying, accidentally smothering the child while sleeping, witchcraft, or evil spirits stealing the child's soul. The church even made laws against mothers sleeping in the same bed as infants under a certain age, threatening religious punishment if a child died during shared sleep. Fever was considered especially dangerous during sleep. The theory was that fever indicated an excess of heat in the body, and the warmth of blankets and bedding would make it worse, potentially cooking the person from inside. Feverish patients were sometimes given minimal covering, or even placed in cool rooms, which probably contributed to some deaths from hypothermia, when people were already weakened by illness. Some illnesses were thought to be contagious specifically through shared sleeping spaces. Bed death was a term used when one person in a bed died, and others who shared that bed subsequently became ill or died. We now know this could be explained by contagious diseases spreading through close contact, but medieval people thought the bed itself had become corrupted or cursed. Medieval physicians wrote lengthy treatises on proper sleep hygiene, most of it based on faulty understanding, but some accidentally useful. They recommended going to bed at consistent times, keeping sleeping areas clean, though their standards for clean were very different from ours, avoiding heavy meals before sleep, getting enough but not too much sleep, and maintaining proper body temperature. Strip away the incorrect theory about humours and miasmas, and some of this advice isn't far off from what modern sleep medicine recommends. But perhaps the most significant health risk during medieval sleep was one they couldn't see or understand: infectious disease. Sleeping in close quarters with multiple people, sharing beds and blankets, poor hygiene, lack of sanitation, and the presence of disease-carrying insects created perfect conditions for illness to spread. Tuberculosis, influenza, typhus, plague, and countless other diseases rippled through medieval communities, often transmitted during the vulnerable hours of sleep. The medieval bedroom wasn't just uncomfortable, it was genuinely dangerous. Every night carried risks that people couldn't fully understand or control. They did their best with the knowledge they had, following medical advice from physicians who were themselves working with completely incorrect theories about how the human body functioned. And yet, despite all these dangers, most people woke up in the morning, survived another night, and continued with their lives. The human body is remarkably resilient, capable of enduring conditions that would seem impossible by modern standards. But make no mistake, medieval sleep was not restorative, peaceful, or healthy. It was a nightly gamble with illness, discomfort, and sometimes death, played out in dark, cold, smelly rooms on beds full of insects surrounded by the sick and the vulnerable. And come morning, they'd do it all over again because they had no other choice. The hearth was the beating heart of every medieval home, the one thing standing between survival and freezing to death. But fire was a demanding and dangerous companion, requiring constant attention and respect. One moment of carelessness, and your entire home could become an inferno. Medieval houses were essentially kindling boxes waiting for a spark. Thatched roofs made from dried straw or reeds, wooden beams and supports, straw mattresses, rushes covering the floor, fabric hangings, stored grain, everything was combustible. Add an open fire pit in the centre of the room with no proper containment, and you have a recipe for disaster. The hearth itself was usually just a raised area of packed earth, or a circle of stones in the middle of the floor. Smoke rose toward the ceiling and eventually escaped through a hole in the roof, or through gaps in the thatch. There was no chimney, no flue, no real control over where the smoke went. It just sort of wandered around the room before finding its way out, filling the living space with thick, choking smoke. Keeping the fire going required constant vigilance. During the day, someone could tend it regularly, adding fuel, rearranging logs, making sure it burned safely. But at night, when everyone needed to sleep, the fire became a problem. Let it go out, and you'd wake up freezing, facing the difficult task of restarting it. Keep it burning too high, and sparks could fly out, landing on the straw mattresses or the thatched roof. This is why the practice of banking the fire became essential. Before bed, someone would carefully bury the hottest coals under a mound of ash, essentially insulating them and slowing their burn rate. Done correctly, the coals would stay alive but contained through the night, ready to be uncovered and fed in the morning. Done incorrectly, the fire either went out completely or worse, smouldered and produced dangerous amounts of carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a very real but completely misunderstood threat. This colourless, odourless gas is produced when fires don't burn completely due to insufficient oxygen. In a sealed medieval house with poor ventilation and a smouldering fire, carbon monoxide could build up to lethal levels. People would go to sleep and simply never wake up, dying quietly in their sleep without ever knowing what happened. Medieval people attributed these mysterious deaths to various causes: divine punishment, evil spirits, or simply the person's time having come. They had no concept of invisible poisonous gas. If multiple people in a household died overnight, it might be blamed on a curse or epidemic, when really it was carbon monoxide from a poorly managed fire. Sparks were another constant danger. Wood fires pop and crack as pockets of moisture or sap heat up and explode. These little explosions send glowing embers flying in all directions. During the day, someone could quickly stamp out any sparks that landed somewhere dangerous. But at night, when everyone was asleep, a single spark could smoulder in straw for an hour before bursting into flame. House fires spread with terrifying speed. Once a thatched roof caught fire, the entire structure could be engulfed in minutes. The smoke alone could kill before the flames reached you, filling the room and making it impossible to see or breathe. In darkness, with multiple people and possibly animals all trying to escape through a single small door, panicked chaos ensued. Medieval villages experienced devastating fires regularly. Because houses were built close together and all used the same combustible materials, a fire in one home could quickly spread to neighbours. Entire villages could burn down in a single night. Communities lived in constant fear of fire, and for good reason. Some towns developed early firefighting strategies, keeping barrels of water at the ready, organising bucket brigades, using long hooks to pull down burning thatch before fire spread. But these were often ineffective once a fire really took hold. The best strategy was prevention, which meant being extremely careful with fire at all times. But carelessness happened, especially when people were exhausted from hard labour. Someone might knock over a rushlight while moving in the dark. A child could stumble too close to the fire pit and scatter embers. An animal could panic and kick burning wood out of the hearth. Hanging clothes or blankets too close to the fire could ignite. Even the simple act of adding fuel to the fire at night carried risks. You couldn't see clearly. Your judgment was impaired by sleepiness, and mistakes happened. Some communities tried to mandate fire safety. Curfew laws, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, required households to bank their fires and extinguish open flames at a certain time each evening. Bell towers would ring curfew, and everyone was supposed to cover their hearths and go to bed. This reduced nighttime fires somewhat, but also meant people spent more time in cold, dark houses. Wealthy homes had some advantages. Stone fireplaces with chimneys, which began appearing in noble houses by the later medieval period, were much safer than open hearth pits. The fire was contained, smoke was directed outside through a proper chimney, and sparks were less likely to escape. But these were expensive and mostly unavailable to common people until much later. Interestingly, the constant exposure to smoke from indoor fires had health consequences medieval people accepted as normal. Chronic respiratory problems, smoker's cough, eye irritation, and lung damage were widespread. Children growing up in smoky houses developed these problems early, but without alternative heating methods, there was no choice but to endure it. Some people tried to minimise smoke by using fuel that burned cleaner. Dry seasoned wood was better than green wood or damp peat, but good firewood was expensive and not always available. Poor families often burned whatever they could find. Peat, which produces heavy, acrid smoke. Dried animal dung, smoky and smelly. Straw or rushes, burns too quickly. Or green wood, smoulders and smokes rather than burning cleanly. The position of your sleeping area relative to the fire was a careful calculation. Too far away, and you froze. Too close, and you risked sparks landing on you or your straw mattress catching fire. Most families arranged sleeping spaces in a rough circle around the hearth, close enough for warmth, but hopefully far enough for safety. Some particularly cautious households kept water buckets near the sleeping area, ready to douse any sudden flames. Others kept sand or dirt available to smother fires quickly. These precautions sometimes helped, but weren't always enough when fire took hold in dry combustible materials. Fire also presented social and legal complications. If your carelessness caused a fire that spread to neighbouring houses, you could be held responsible for the damages. In some places, causing a fire through negligence was a serious crime. This added social pressure to be careful, but also meant that fire victims might face punishment on top of losing their homes and possessions. Despite all these dangers, the fire remained absolutely essential. Without it, winter nights would be lethal for many. The warmth it provided, the ability to cook food, and the small amount of light it gave were worth the risks. Medieval people became skilled at fire management out of pure necessity, learning through experience and sometimes tragedy how to balance warmth and safety. But the relationship with fire was never comfortable. It was a nightly negotiation between freezing and burning, between the darkness and the danger of light. Every medieval night ended with someone taking responsibility for the fire, banking it, positioning it, hoping it would behave through the long, dark hours. And in the morning, if everyone woke up alive, if the house still stood, if no sparks had found dry straw in the night, then it was counted as a successful evening. The fire was uncovered, coaxed back to life, and the whole precarious cycle began again. Fire was friend and enemy, necessity and threat, warmth and danger. It kept you alive while simultaneously being one of the things most likely to kill you. Welcome to medieval life, where even staying warm could be fatal. To fully understand medieval sleep, we need to explore the spiritual dimension, the invisible world of souls, demons, angels, and forces that medieval people believed were most active during nighttime hours. For them, darkness wasn't just a physical condition, it was a spiritual state when the barriers between the earthly realm and the supernatural thinned dangerously. The medieval Christian worldview held that the world was locked in a cosmic battle between good and evil. God and his angels fought constantly against Satan and his demons for control of human souls, and nighttime was when demonic forces gained extra strength, prowling through the world looking for vulnerable souls to corrupt or claim. This belief was reinforced from the pulpit every Sunday. Priests warned their congregations about the spiritual dangers lurking in darkness. Children were taught from their earliest years that night belonged to evil, that demons walked freely after sunset, and that only faith and prayer could protect sleeping Christians from supernatural attack. Sleep itself was seen as a spiritually vulnerable state. When you slept, your conscious mind withdrew, leaving your soul less defended against demonic influence. Dreams could be messages from God, or temptations from Satan. You might wake up having sinned in your dreams, requiring confession and penance, even though you'd done nothing in the physical world. The concept of spiritual warfare manifested in evening prayers. Families would pray together before bed, asking God to protect them through the night, to guard their souls while they slept, and to ward off evil spirits. Specific prayers existed for nighttime protection, asking saints, especially Saint Michael the Archangel, the warrior against demons, to stand watch over the sleeping household. Crosses were hung on walls or over doorways, believed to repel demons who couldn't enter a space marked with holy symbols. Holy water was sprinkled around sleeping areas. Some families kept blessed candles that were lit only during storms or particularly frightening nights, believing the consecrated light would drive away evil. Religious medals, scapulars, and other blessed objects were worn even during sleep. Parents tied protective amulets around children's necks, mixing Christian symbols with older folk magic, bits of rowan wood, iron nails, certain herbs, anything that tradition claimed would ward off evil. The Church officially frowned on these non-Christian practices, but usually turned a blind eye because they understood people's genuine terror of the night. The devil himself was imagined as particularly active at night. Medieval art frequently depicted demons as creatures of darkness, unable to tolerate light, forced to conduct their evil business in shadow. The belief was that Satan and his minions literally couldn't function in daylight, which was why dawn brought such relief. The powers of evil had to retreat with the rising sun. Nightmares were interpreted through this spiritual lens. The Old English word mare originally referred to a demon that sat on sleepers' chests, causing bad dreams and difficulty breathing. This demon, often depicted as a small, ugly creature, was thought to be sent by Satan to torment the faithful and plant evil thoughts during their most vulnerable hours. Sleep paralysis, that terrifying phenomenon where you wake up but can't move, often accompanied by a sense of presence and chest pressure, was universally attributed to demonic attack. People who experienced it genuinely believed they had been visited by a demon or witch. The experience was so frightening and the belief so strong that some people refused to sleep alone for fear of being defenseless during such attacks. Witches were believed to travel at night, either in spirit form or physically through magical means. They supposedly entered homes through chimneys or keyholes, attacked sleeping people, and even stole babies to sacrifice to Satan. The fear of witches was so pervasive that certain protective rituals became common. Iron horseshoes over doors, salt sprinkled on windowsills, special prayers recited before bed. Ghosts and restless spirits were also thought to wander at night. The dead who hadn't been properly buried, who had unfinished business, or who had died in sin were believed to return to the earthly realm after dark. These spirits might appear to the living during dreams or even manifest in the sleeping area, seeking prayers, revenge, or simply unable to rest. Some medieval people reported seeing deceased relatives or friends during the night, either in dreams or in that hazy state between sleeping and waking. These visitations were taken very seriously. If the spirit seemed peaceful and asked for prayers, families would offer masses for the dead person's soul. If the spirit seemed angry or threatening, it might require a priest to perform rituals to lay it to rest. The hour between midnight and dawn was considered especially dangerous. the devil's hour or dead time when supernatural activity peaked. People who woke during these hours often felt profound unease, a sense that they were awake during a time when humans should be sleeping, when other forces had dominion over the world. This made the practice of segmented sleep, first sleep and second sleep, somewhat spiritually fraught. During the wakeful period in the middle of the night, people were encouraged to pray rather than engage in worldly activities. Some religious orders specifically held midnight prayer services, believing this was when prayer was most needed to combat the forces of darkness. Children were especially vulnerable to spiritual threats, according to medieval belief. Their innocent souls were prizes sought by demons, and their bodies were weak and defenseless during sleep. Parents would make the sign of the cross over sleeping children, whisper protective prayers, and ensure holy symbols were nearby. Infant mortality was so high that parents lived in constant fear of their babies dying during the night, and many attributed these deaths to demonic or supernatural causes. Sudden infant death, which we now call SIDS, was often blamed on changelings, a fairy or demon that supposedly switched places with the real child, leaving behind a sickly imposter that would soon die. This belief was so strong that some desperate parents subjected sick babies to cruel tests or treatments to try to drive out the changeling and retrieve their real child, practices that modern readers find horrifying. The fear of dying during sleep was also spiritually charged. Medieval Christianity taught that dying while asleep, without a chance to confess sins or receive last rites, could endanger your immortal soul. Many people prayed before bed not just for protection through the night, but for the grace of waking in the morning so they could continue their spiritual journey toward salvation. Church bells ringing through the night served multiple purposes, marking hours for prayer, but also literally believed to drive away demons with their sacred sound. Communities felt safer knowing church bells would ring periodically through the darkness, pushing back the evil forces that gathered in shadow. Some saints were specifically invoked for nighttime protection. St. Christopher protected travellers, but also those journeying through the dangerous passage of sleep. St. Barbara was called upon to protect against sudden death. St. Dymphna helped those suffering from nightmares and mental anguish. Each saint had their specialty, and medieval people prayed to whichever seemed most relevant to their particular fears. Religious communities, monks and nuns, had a different relationship with nighttime. Their monastic schedules included vigils, prayers held during the night hours. Rather than fearing the darkness, they sought to sanctify it through worship. But even in monasteries, the night watches were considered challenging and dangerous times when monks were most vulnerable to temptation and demonic attack. Medieval mystical literature is full of accounts of spiritual battles that took place during the night. Saints reported fighting demons in their cells, experiencing terrifying visions, being physically assaulted by evil spirits. These accounts reinforced for ordinary believers that the nighttime spiritual dangers were real, and that only strong faith provided protection. Interestingly, this fear created community bonds. Knowing that everyone faced the same spiritual threats during darkness made the shared experience of surviving each night a communal accomplishment. Morning prayers often included thanksgiving not just for the new day, but for protection through the night that had passed. The spiritual dimension of medieval sleep is easy for modern people to dismiss as superstition, but for medieval Europeans, it was as real as the physical dangers they faced. The demons, ghosts, and evil spirits weren't metaphors. They were genuine threats requiring real protective measures. The darkness held terrors both seen and unseen, and closing your eyes meant trusting in God's protection against forces that sought your destruction. This belief system created genuine psychological stress, the anxiety of knowing you were entering a spiritually dangerous state every night, that your soul was vulnerable while you slept, that demons literally wanted to claim you. This took a toll on mental health and sleep quality. Many people struggled with anxiety around bedtime, dreading the coming darkness and its attendant spiritual dangers. Yet paradoxically, this same belief system also provided comfort. The prayers, rituals, and protective symbols gave people a sense of agency, a feeling that they could do something to protect themselves and their families. Faith wasn't passive, it was an active defense against the darkness, and when morning came, when the first light crept through gaps in the shutters, When the roosters crowed and the world emerged from shadow, there was genuine relief and gratitude. They had survived another night. God had protected them once again. The evil forces had retreated and life could continue. Until the next sunset, when the cycle would begin again, and once more they'd have to trust that faith, prayer, and blessed symbols would keep them safe through the dangerous hours of darkness. Medieval sleep wasn't just physically challenging, it was spiritually terrifying. Every night was a test of faith, a battle against unseen enemies, a journey through darkness, both literal and metaphorical. And somehow, night after night, generation after generation, they endured. While medieval people worried about demons and evil spirits, they also faced very real, very human threats during nighttime hours. The darkness that fell over villages and towns didn't just conceal supernatural forces, it provided perfect cover for criminals, thieves, and those with violent intentions. Medieval society had limited law enforcement as we understand it today. There were no police patrols, no emergency response numbers to call, no forensic science to investigate crimes. Justice was often local, informal and reactive rather than preventive. This meant that once darkness fell and everyone retreated to their homes, you were largely on your own if something went wrong. Theft was the most common nighttime crime. Peasant homes rarely had proper locks, just a simple wooden bar across the door, sometimes not even that. Determined thieves could easily force entry, and in the deep darkness they could ransack a home while the occupants slept. The poor might not have much worth stealing, but what little they did have, tools, stored food, a chicken or two, could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Wealthier homes were more attractive targets, but usually better defended. They might have stronger doors, iron locks, possibly even servants who took turns staying awake through the night as watchmen. But even these precautions weren't foolproof. Clever thieves found ways in, and the darkness gave them time to search thoroughly for valuables. Livestock theft was a major problem in rural areas. A cow, pig, or sheep represented significant wealth for a peasant family. Thieves would creep into yards, or even into the shared living spaces where animals slept and make off with livestock under cover of darkness. The animals might make noise, but in a medieval village where animal sounds were constant, distinguishing between normal nighttime animal behaviour and theft wasn't easy. Some communities tried to combat this with night watches, men taking turns patrolling the village, calling out periodically to prove they were awake and alert. But these patrols were often ineffective. The watchmen themselves sometimes fell asleep, or they were easily avoided by criminals who knew the patrol routes. Violence was another nighttime threat. Disputes that had simmered during the day could turn deadly after dark, when inhibitions lowered and visibility made it hard to identify attackers. A neighbour with a grudge might wait for darkness to settle a score. Drunken fights, often starting in taverns, could spill out into dark streets where they turned fatal. Domestic violence increased at night when families were confined in small spaces with no escape or privacy. Tensions that built throughout the day exploded once everyone was home. Women and children were particularly vulnerable, with few options for help or protection. The darkness concealed what happened inside homes, and even if neighbours heard screaming, interfering in another family's business was socially complicated. Travelling at night was considered extremely dangerous and was generally avoided. Roads were unmarked, lighting non-existent, and bandits knew that anyone travelling after dark was either desperate or carrying something valuable. Those who had to travel at night, messengers, merchants with urgent business, did so in groups when possible and heavily armed. Towns and cities had their own nighttime dangers. After curfew, when respectable people were home and fires were covered, the streets belonged to criminals. Pickpockets, muggers, and con artists worked the dark alleys. Prostitution, while technically illegal, flourished in the nighttime shadow economy. Gambling dens and illegal taverns operated after hours, attracting unsavoury characters. Some cities employed night watchmen or early police forces, but these were often understaffed, underpaid, and ineffective. Watchmen might patrol main streets while criminals operated freely in the maze of narrow alleys and courtyards. The wealthy hired private guards, but ordinary people had no such protection. The darkness also enabled terrible crimes that would be harder to commit in daylight. Arson attacks happened at night when occupants were asleep and less able to escape. People with violent revenge fantasies could approach homes unseen. In cities, the disposal of bodies, victims of murder or disease, often happened at night to avoid detection and public scandal. Sexual assault was a nighttime danger, particularly for women who had to venture outside for any reason, to use an outdoor privy, to fetch water, to tend animals. The total darkness meant attackers could strike and disappear without being identified. Victims had little recourse. Reporting such crimes was shameful, evidence was impossible to gather, and prosecutions rarely succeeded. Home invasions could turn violent quickly. If thieves encountered resistance, or if they had violent intentions from the start, sleeping families were vulnerable. Without modern communication, you couldn't call for help. Your only options were fighting back or hoping the attackers would take what they wanted and leave. Children were at risk of kidnapping. In an era of high child mortality and strict inheritance laws, desperate people sometimes stole children, to raise as their own, to sell to childless families, or for darker purposes. Parents lived in fear of waking to find a child missing, vanished into the night without a trace. Even legitimate authority figures could pose threats. Corrupt officials, tax collectors, or soldiers might abuse their power at night when witnesses were few and accountability limited. Medieval justice was often harsh and arbitrary, and darkness allowed those in power to operate without scrutiny. The lack of street lighting meant that even innocent nighttime activities were dangerous. Someone leaving their home for a legitimate reason, a medical emergency, a fire, urgent news, risked injury from simply not being able to see where they were going. Falling into open ditches, walking into walls, tripping over obstacles, or getting lost in familiar areas were common problems. Some communities tried to improve safety through regulations. Houses might be required to hang lanterns outside their doors on certain nights. Shops were forbidden from creating obstacles in streets. Severe penalties were announced for nighttime crimes, but enforcement was difficult, and the fundamental problem remained. Darkness eliminated accountability. Medieval people developed various personal protection strategies. Sleeping with weapons nearby, knives, clubs, farm implements, was common, especially for those living in isolated areas. Dogs served as alarm systems, barking at unusual noises or intruders. Some people slept lightly, training themselves to wake at the slightest disturbance. Neighbours looked out for each other to some extent. In close-packed villages where everyone knew everyone else, unusual nighttime activity might be noticed and investigated. But this communal surveillance also meant that privacy was non-existent and rumours spread quickly, creating their own social problems. Religious communities offered some safety. Monasteries and convents, while not immune to crime, were generally more secure than ordinary homes. They had stone walls, locked gates, and communal sleeping arrangements that made violence less likely. In times of trouble, nearby residents might seek sanctuary in religious buildings, requesting temporary shelter until danger passed. Wealthy individuals could afford better protection, strong locks, guards, dogs, secure compounds, but even they weren't completely safe. History records numerous instances of nobles being attacked in their own homes, of castle break-ins, of violence penetrating even the most secure defences. Darkness was a great equaliser in some ways. It threatened everyone, regardless of social class. The psychological impact of these nighttime threats was significant. The constant low-level fear, the awareness that danger could strike at any moment, the inability to feel truly safe even in your own home. This created chronic stress that affected health and well-being. Children grew up understanding that the world was dangerous and that darkness was when that danger peaked. Interestingly, this reality influenced medieval architecture and urban planning. Homes were built close together, partly for mutual protection. Villages clustered tightly around a central point, often a church or manor house, so that help was nearby. Windows were small and few, partly for warmth but also to prevent easy entry. Doors were positioned for visibility and defence. Some communities held seasonal celebrations to mark the longest nights of winter as symbolic triumphs over darkness and danger. These festivals often included bonfires, group gatherings, and rituals meant to strengthen community bonds and reinforce collective security. The message was clear: together, we can survive the dangerous hours. By morning, when light returned and the legitimate business of the day resumed, the night's dangers receded. But the memory remained, and the knowledge that when darkness fell again, the threats would return. Medieval people lived with this constant cycle, safety in daylight, vulnerability after sunset every day of their lives. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was an absence of order, of law, of safety. It was time when the normal rules of society loosened, and those with ill intentions had opportunity. Sleep meant closing your eyes to these dangers, trusting in luck, prayer, and whatever defensive measures you could afford, and hoping that when morning came, you and your family would still be there to see it. We've touched on the fact that medieval people rarely slept alone, but let's dive deeper into what this actually meant for nightly life. The modern concept of personal space, of having your own bed in your own room where you can sleep without being disturbed, would have seemed bizarre and possibly even sad to medieval people. Sleep was a communal activity, and that came with its own complicated social dynamics. In a typical peasant household, you might have parents, several children of various ages, perhaps a grandparent or elderly relative, maybe a widowed aunt or orphaned cousin, all sharing the same sleeping space, often the same sleeping surface. This wasn't a choice made for warmth alone, though that was a factor. It was simply how families functioned. The sleeping arrangement itself had a hierarchy. The most desirable spot, closest to the fire but not so close as to risk sparks, typically went to the head of household and his wife. They might share a proper bed frame if the family owned one. Children would be arranged around them based on age and need. Infants slept with or very near their mothers for nursing and warmth. Toddlers might be sandwiched between older siblings. Grandparents who needed extra warmth but were less likely to roll onto a baby accidentally got strategic placement. This arrangement required careful choreography. Everyone had to settle in roughly the same order each night. If you needed to get up during the night, to use the chamber pot to check the fire, to comfort a crying chiel. D. You had to carefully step over or around multiple sleeping bodies in total darkness. One wrong move and you'd step on someone's hand, trip over a leg, or accidentally kick a sibling, starting a chain reaction of complaints and disruption. Privacy was completely non-existent. Every sound was shared. Snoring, coughing, crying, passing gas, the rustling of straw as someone shifted position, the whispered conversations between spouses. If someone had nightmares and cried out, everyone heard. If a child wet the bed, everyone nearby felt the dampness spreading through the shared straw. If someone was sick and vomiting, the whole family was aware and affected. Intimacy between married couples had to happen in this shared space. Parents developed strategies, waiting until children were deeply asleep, using the cover of darkness and general nighttime sounds, sometimes simply being very quiet and quick. It wasn't romantic by modern standards, but it was practical necessity. Children eventually learned to ignore certain sounds and movements, understanding that some things were adult business. Snoring was a major source of nighttime conflict. When multiple people are packed into a small space, and at least one or two are loud snorers, sleep becomes difficult for everyone else. There was no moving to a different room, no spouse retreating to the couch. You either learned to sleep through the snoring, or you didn't sleep well. Some families developed elaborate systems of prodding or repositioning the snorer, though this often just led to more disruption. Body temperature differences created disputes. Some people naturally run hot, others cold. When you're pressed against multiple bodies under shared blankets, these differences become pronounced. Someone would always be too hot or too cold, and negotiating the amount of covering was a nightly challenge. Children often fought over prime positions in the warmth cluster, and parents had to mediate these conflicts even while trying to sleep themselves. Bedtimes weren't uniform. Young children might go to sleep early, but older children, teenagers, and adults might stay up later around the fire, talking, working on small tasks, or just enjoying a bit of quiet after the little ones were asleep. When these late-to-bed family members finally settled in, they had to do so quietly to avoid waking everyone else, not always successfully. Morning wake-ups were similarly chaotic. Early risers, often the adults who had work to do, had to get up and start their day while others were still sleeping. In the confined space with everyone tightly packed, this meant disturbing multiple people. The first person up would rekindle the fire, creating noise and light. Then they'd need to move about, gather clothes and tools, possibly wake children who had chores to do. The idea of sleeping in peacefully until you woke naturally was a luxury few experienced. Sickness in the family made shared sleeping particularly challenging. When one person had a contagious illness, and in an era before germ theory, people didn't understand how diseases spread. everyone in the sleeping cluster was exposed. A cold, fever, or stomach ailment would ripple through the family, sometimes affecting everyone within days. There was no way to isolate the sick person, except perhaps moving them to a slightly more distant pile of straw, which did little good when you were all breathing the same smoky, close air. Conflicts that arose during the day didn't disappear at bedtime. If siblings were fighting, they still had to sleep inches apart. If spouses were angry with each other, they still shared a bed. If you'd quarrelled with a parent or grandparent, you still had to settle into the same sleeping area with them. The forced proximity meant that many conflicts either had to be resolved before sleep or had to be endured through an uncomfortable night of cold shoulders and resentful silence. Some families developed elaborate social rules around shared sleeping. Whose job was it to get up and tend the fire? Who took responsibility for the chamber pot in the morning? Who dealt with a crying baby? These weren't written rules but understood divisions of labour that kept the system functioning. When someone violated these unspoken agreements, failing to do their assigned task or waking others unnecessarily, it created resentment that festered through subsequent nights. Guests complicated the arrangements even further. Medieval hospitality customs meant that travellers, visiting relatives or friends in need, might be welcome to stay overnight. This meant even more bodies squeezed into the already crowded sleeping area. Sometimes guests of higher social status would be given the best spot, displacing the usual sleeping hierarchy and creating mild resentment among family members who had to sleep in less comfortable positions. Adolescence created its own awkward dynamics. As children matured into young adults, the close physical proximity of communal sleeping became more complicated. Teenage boys and girls sleeping near each other, even as siblings or cousins, raised concerns about propriety. Some families tried to create slight separations, boys on one side, girls on another, but in a single-room dwelling, these divisions were more symbolic than functional. Elderly family members sometimes had special needs that affected everyone. A grandparent with incontinence meant dealing with smell and dampness in the shared sleeping area. One who was confused or had dementia might wake and wander during the night, disturbing everyone. A family member in pain might moan or cry out, preventing others from sleeping. Yet medieval culture strongly emphasized caring for elderly relatives, so families accepted these challenges as obligations. The seasonal variation in sleeping arrangements added another layer. In the coldest winter months, everyone huddled tightly together, maximizing warmth regardless of personal preference or comfort. In summer, when the heat was oppressive, families might spread out more, with some members sleeping outside or in whatever separate spaces could be found, lofts, storage areas, even outdoors under the stars. This communal sleeping did have some benefits. Children never felt alone or abandoned. The presence of parents and siblings provided comfort and security. If someone had a nightmare or woke frightened, others were right there to provide reassurance. The constant physical closeness reinforced family bonds in a tangible, if sometimes uncomfortable way. It also meant that serious problems were harder to hide. If someone was seriously ill, everyone knew immediately. If a child was struggling with something, parents would notice. If relationships were deteriorating, the close quarters made it obvious. This lack of privacy could be protective in some ways, ensuring that problems were addressed rather than hidden. However, the lack of personal space also created stress. Humans need some amount of privacy and solitude for psychological health. Medieval people, especially those in crowded households, had almost none. This constant togetherness day and night could fray nerves and tempers. Small annoyances became major irritations when you never got a break from the person causing them. Some people sought solitude in creative ways. An early morning walk to tend animals, a trip to the village well, even a longer than necessary visit to the privy might be motivated partly by the desire for a few moments alone. But these opportunities were rare and brief. For the most part, medieval people lived their entire lives surrounded by others, with true privacy a fleeting luxury. The psychological adjustment required for this lifestyle is hard for modern people to imagine. We're so accustomed to personal space, to being able to retreat to our own rooms, to controlling who has access to our sleeping areas. Medieval people had none of this. They developed different psychological boundaries, different tolerances for proximity and communal living. Interestingly, wealthy nobles who could afford private chambers sometimes still chose to sleep with attendants nearby. Having servants sleep in or near your chamber meant you could call for help or service at any time. but it also meant you were never truly alone. Different social classes had different versions of shared sleep, but very few people in medieval society slept in true solitude. The transition to more private sleeping arrangements happened gradually over centuries, as houses grew larger, as concepts of privacy evolved, and as families became smaller. But during the medieval period, communal sleep was the norm, and it shaped family dynamics, social relationships, and individual psychology in profound ways. Going to sleep wasn't a private act of personal rest. It was a social event, a family gathering, a nightly ritual that reinforced your place in the household hierarchy and the community. Your sleeping position, your sleeping companions, and your behaviour during the shared sleep period all reflected and reinforced your social role. And while we might look back and see this communal sleeping as cramped and uncomfortable, for medieval people it was simply life. They knew nothing else, and the idea of sleeping alone in a separate room would have seemed lonely, possibly dangerous, and somewhat unnatural. The night brought many challenges: cold, darkness, danger, discomfort. But at least you didn't face them alone. You faced them pressed against your family, sharing warmth and breath, and the hope that morning would come for all of you together. That communal survival, that shared vulnerability, created bonds that modern individual sleepers might never fully understand. For better or worse, medieval people lived and slept as a collective, and that shaped everything about their experience of night. After a night of cold, darkness, fear and discomfort, the first light of dawn wasn't just welcome, it was a profound relief, a small victory over the many things that could have gone wrong, but didn't. The medieval morning ritual began long before the sun fully rose, and it revealed just how much work went into simply surviving the night. The first person to wake, usually the household head or the mother, faced the critical task of reviving the fire. They'd carefully approach the hearth in the pre-dawn dimness and begin uncovering the banked coals from their ash blanket. If the fire had stayed alive through the night, glowing embers would be visible, still radiating a bit of warmth. This was the best possible outcome, and it warranted a quick prayer of thanksgiving. Those embers would be fed carefully, first with dry kindling, then with progressively larger pieces of fuel, coaxing the fire back to full life. As flames grew and light increased, the room would slowly transform from a dark, cold cave into something resembling a livable space again. The returning warmth was almost physically painful, if your extremities had gone numb during the night, but it was welcome pain, the feeling of life returning. If the fire had died completely during the night, the morning routine became much more difficult. Creating fire from scratch required striking flint against steel to produce sparks, catching them on tinder, and patiently blowing the tiny flame into something sustainable. In the cold darkness of a winter morning, with stiff fingers and empty stomach, this task could take a frustratingly long time. Some unfortunate families might have to borrow fire from a neighbour, carrying glowing coals in a container back to their own hearth, which was embarrassing and time-consuming. As the fire grew, other family members would begin stirring. Children would wake to the sounds and smells of the reviving hearth. Bodies would untangle themselves from the communal sleeping pile, each person stiff from a night on uncomfortable straw, probably itching from insect bites, their clothes wrinkled and their hair dishevelled. The chamber pot needed emptying first thing, a job that often fell to children or the lowest-ranking household member. They'd carry the sloshing container outside and toss the contents into the street, a midden pit, or wherever the household disposed of waste. In cities, a shout of warning was customary, before flinging waste from a window, giving pedestrians below a chance to avoid being doused. Mornings in medieval towns were fragrant with the collective result of everyone performing the same task. Personal hygiene, such as it was, came next. Most people would wash their hands and face in cold water, splash their eyes to fully wake up, maybe rinse their mouth. Full bathing wasn't part of the daily routine. That was an occasional event at best. Instead, people just accepted their body odour, adjusted their clothes, the same ones worn the previous day, probably slept in, and prepared to start the day's work. Breakfast was simple and quick, if it happened at all. Many peasants simply broke their fast with ale or watered wine, maybe a piece of old bread, perhaps some leftover porridge heated by the newly revived fire. The substantial meal would come later in the day after morning chores were completed. Children were sent out to tend animals, fetch water, gather fuel, or perform other essential tasks, often while still rubbing sleep from their eyes. The household had to be set in order. Straw mattresses were sometimes shaken out or moved to allow sweeping of the floor. Blankets were folded or hung to air. The sleeping area had to transform back into a multi-purpose living space where work and eating would happen throughout the day. Outside, the village or town would be slowly coming to life. Roosters crowed, announcing the dawn. Church bells rang, marking the hour for morning prayers and reminding the community of their spiritual duties. Smoke began rising from numerous chimneys and roof holes as fires were rekindled across the settlement. People emerged from their homes, greeting neighbours, sharing news of the night. "How did you fare?" was a common morning greeting, a genuine question about whether anything bad had happened during the dark hours. If a family had experienced a fire, a death, a difficult birth, a break-in, or any other nighttime crisis, the morning was when news spread. Communities would mobilise to help those who'd suffered misfortune, bringing food, offering labour, providing comfort. For those who worked outdoors, farmers, labourers, craftsmen, morning meant preparing tools and heading to work. For women, it meant starting the endless cycle of food preparation, childcare, and household tasks that would fill the daylight hours. Children might have lessons, chores, or apprenticeship duties depending on their age and family situation. The sheer relief of having survived the night is difficult for modern people to fully grasp. We don't think of sleep as dangerous, of darkness as life-threatening, of morning as deliverance. But for medieval people, the transition from night to day was significant every single time it happened. They'd made it through another night of cold, another night of vulnerability, another night when so many things could have gone wrong. There was genuine gratitude in morning prayers, not the rote recitation of memorised words, but heartfelt thanks for protection through the dangerous hours, for another day of life, for the return of light and relative safety. The medieval morning prayer routine wasn't just religious obligation, it was the expression of relief and hope. As the sun climbed higher and the day fully established itself, the terrors and discomforts of night would recede in memory. There was work to do, always so much work. Fields to tend, animals to care for, food to prepare, repairs to make, children to supervise. The daylight hours were filled with back-breaking labour, but at least you could see what you were doing. At least you weren't cold and afraid in the dark. And as the day progressed toward evening, there would be a growing sense of dread. Because night would come again. The cycle would repeat. Soon you'd have to retreat back into that cold, dark, uncomfortable, frightening space and trust once more that morning would eventually arrive. But for now, in the early morning light, there was a brief window of peace. You'd survived. Your family had survived. The fire was burning, the day had work to offer, and the night's dangers were temporarily banished. This daily cycle, dread, endurance, relief, gratitude, and then gradually building dread again, shaped the medieval psychological landscape in ways we can barely understand. Their relationship with sleep, darkness, and nighttime was fundamentally different from ours. Where we see sleep as restorative rest in a safe, comfortable environment, they saw it as a necessary but dangerous ordeal to be survived. The morning wasn't just the start of a new day. It was evidence that you'd made it through, that you'd beaten the odds once more, that you'd been granted another chance at life. And that was something worth celebrating, even if the only celebration was a quiet moment of gratitude before the hard work of the day began again. When we look back at medieval sleep, we're really looking at a comprehensive picture of vulnerability. Every element we've explored, the cold, the darkness, the insects, the smells, the spiritual fears, the physical dangers, the lack of privacy, the medical misunderstandings, combined into an experience that was less about rest and more about survival. Medieval people didn't have restful sleep as we understand it. They didn't have 8 uninterrupted hours in a comfortable bed, in a quiet, temperature-controlled room. They didn't have the luxury of feeling safe and secure as they drifted off. Instead, they had something closer to a nightly ordeal, a test of endurance that they faced every single evening of their lives. Think about what they endured, lying on decomposing straw, crawling with insects, wrapped in scratchy wool that was never quite warm enough, breathing smoky air in total darkness, pressed against multiple family members and possibly livestock, listening to every sound and wondering if it represented danger. praying that evil spirits would pass them by, hoping the fire wouldn't go out or spread, trusting that they'd wake in the morning still alive and intact. This wasn't an occasional camping trip adventure. This wasn't a hardship they endured for a short time during difficult circumstances. This was every single night for their entire lives, with no prospect of it ever getting better. And yet, they adapted. Humans are remarkably resilient creatures, capable of normalizing almost any conditions if necessary. Medieval people didn't spend every night paralyzed with fear or misery. They found humor in their situation, created rituals and routines that provided comfort, developed social bonds strengthened by shared hardship, and cultivated a mental toughness that modern people might envy. They told stories and sang songs around the fire before bed. They created elaborate spiritual practices that gave meaning to the darkness. They looked after each other, shared warmth, and protected the vulnerable. They developed practical wisdom about fire management, sleeping positions, and nighttime safety that was passed down through generations. Children born into these conditions didn't know any different. They grew up accepting flea bites, cold nights, smoky rooms, and communal sleeping as normal parts of life. They developed psychological adaptations that helped them cope. The ability to sleep despite discomfort, to ignore certain sounds, to feel safe in situations we'd find terrifying. But that doesn't mean medieval sleep was easy or pleasant. The toll it took was real. Chronic sleep deprivation from constant disruptions affected health, mood, and life expectancy. The cold caused genuine suffering and killed the vulnerable, the very young, the very old, the sick and weak. The lack of hygiene spread disease. The fears and anxieties created psychological stress. When we complain about our sleep today, the room is too warm, the mattress is slightly lumpy, we can hear traffic outside, it's worth remembering what sleep used to mean. Our ancestors would have considered our worst sleeping conditions to be unimaginable luxury. A bed to yourself, with an actual mattress, in a room with a door that closes, at a comfortable temperature, with lights you can control, without insects or animals or a dozen other people, where you feel safe from danger and can sleep as long as you need. This would have seemed like a fantasy, something kings and queens might dream about but never experience. The evolution of sleep from the medieval period to now represents one of humanity's great quality of life improvements. We've gained private space, comfortable beds, temperature control, artificial light, effective pest control, indoor plumbing, security, medical understanding, and the luxury of treating sleep as restorative rest rather than dangerous ordeal. Yet perhaps we've also lost something. The shared experience of night, the communal vulnerability, the daily reminder of how fragile life is, the intimate family bonds created by literally sleeping together. These created a different kind of human connection that's harder to find in our private bedrooms behind locked doors. Medieval people lived with a constant awareness of danger and death that modern life shields us from. Every morning was a genuine triumph, evidence of survival, a gift to be grateful for. We've gained comfort and security, but we've lost some of that acute appreciation for simply being alive. Their relationship with sleep also reflected a different relationship with time and nature. They lived according to sun cycles, accepting darkness as a natural rhythm of life, rather than something to be conquered with artificial light. Their segmented sleep pattern, first sleep and second sleep with a wakeful period in between, was arguably more natural than our modern expectation of 8 consecutive hours. As we deal with modern sleep problems, insomnia, sleep apnea, circadian rhythm disorders, some researchers have looked back at medieval sleep patterns for insights. Maybe our contemporary sleep troubles partly stem from fighting against natural rhythms that medieval people accepted. But let's not romanticize the past. Given the choice, virtually everyone would choose modern sleeping conditions over medieval ones. The comfort, safety, hygiene, and rest quality we enjoy today are genuine improvements, not just different ways of living. The medieval sleep experience teaches us several lessons. First, humans are incredibly adaptable. We can survive and even thrive in conditions that seem impossible. Second, what we consider essential comforts are actually recent luxuries that our ancestors lived without. Third, every generation faces challenges that seem normal to them, but would horrify both their ancestors and descendants. Medieval people sleeping in their cold, dark, bug-infested huts would be amazed. and perhaps confused by our concerns. You have a warm, soft private bed and you still can't sleep. You worry about the room being slightly too warm. Your worst problem is hearing your phone notifications, but they would also be envious. Deep down, beneath the stoic acceptance and dark humour, medieval people desperately wanted better sleep. They wanted to be warm and comfortable and safe. They wanted privacy and cleanliness. They wanted their children to survive the night. They wanted to wake up refreshed instead of exhausted and aching. They just had no way to achieve these things with the technology and knowledge available to them. So they did what humans always do. They adapted. They endured. They made the best of difficult circumstances. They told themselves stories that made the darkness less frightening. They created rituals that gave meaning to suffering. They found small comforts in the warmth of family, the crackle of the fire, the knowledge that everyone faced the same struggles. And every morning when they woke, cold, itchy, tired, but alive, they counted themselves fortunate and prepared to do it all over again. That was medieval sleep. Not a peaceful journey to refreshing rest, but a nightly gamble where the stakes were survival itself. A test of faith, endurance, and luck that happened every single night, from birth until death. We've come a long way since then. Our beds are warmer, softer, safer, and more comfortable than medieval people could have imagined. We sleep alone or by choice with partners, in rooms designed specifically for rest, protected by locks and laws and lighting. But somewhere in the back of our evolutionary memory, we remember when darkness was total and threatening, when cold could kill, when sleep meant vulnerability. That's why even now, in our comfortable modern beds, some of us still feel uneasy in complete darkness, still check that doors are locked, still feel relief when morning comes. We're not that far removed from our medieval ancestors, really. Just a few dozen generations separate us from people who faced those nightly terrors as routine. Their resilience, their courage, and yes, their suffering is part of what made us possible. So tonight, when you climb into your comfortable bed, in your safe, warm room, with electric lights at your fingertips and modern medicine protecting you from ancient dangers, take a moment to appreciate how remarkable it is. Sleep, true restful sleep, is a luxury that most humans throughout history never experienced. And maybe, just maybe, send a thought back through the centuries to those medieval families, huddled together in their cold, dark huts, doing their best to survive another night. They made it through so we could be here. The least we can do is acknowledge their struggle and be grateful for the progress that's been made. Sweet dreams, you've earned them, your ancestors certainly did.